Hello everyone, we are going to have a look at the game of the day of the round number 11 of the candidates tournament. So it's a game between Anish Giri and Liren, Anish Giri with white. So let's see what happened in the game. Let's keep the suspense for now. So Anish played against the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Gao 2 days ago. He played, or 3 days ago, he played d4 on the first move. But here he is playing e4, so it's no surprise that Anish is able to play both moves without any problem. So he played e4. As often, Liren decides to go with the solid move e5. So Spanish Rey Lopez arose in the game. After bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, all this is very theoretical. This is a classical variation, and here, let's say it's a surprise by Anish Giri. He played bishop takes c6. So it's a side positional line, whereas it sounds illogical because the bishop has moved to a4, and only now he takes on c6 after having played bishop a4. But it's not useless to having played the previous moves. So after d takes c6 and d3, as we see, the pawn on e5 is hanging, so black has to do something about it. And usually, if he doesn't have, for example, the knight on f6, he may be able to go f6. So this is no longer possible here in opposition to the exchange Spanish variation. And here, after d3, the theory says knight d7. In most of the games, black played knight d7, and this was Liren's choice as the only time he faced this position. He won a game in a rapid game in Calcutta against Magnus Carlsen with black, so quite a fine win for him. And the game continued with knight bd2, short castle, and a4. The point of playing a4 for white is to secure the square on c4 for the knight at some point. So black played a5, and after b3, white is willing to bring the knight towards c4, and something like f6, knight h4, knight c5, knight f5. There are definitely some ideas for white, but still in this game, Liren has won with black. Still, he doesn't want to repeat the same opening. I think he understands that Giri has prepared this line especially. That's why he chose bishop to d6, which is one of the many sidelines that black has. So he protects the pawn on e5. Anish played knight bd2, so the knight wants to come to either c4 or b3. That's why he doesn't go for knight c3 instead. He doesn't have anything to do on c3, so white's goal is to bring the knight somewhere on the light squares, not on c3. Bishop e6 was played, and here, quite surprisingly, already a novelty by Anish Giri. He played knight to b3, which has never been played for some reason. Instead, most of the games went with b3, more or less as Magnus did against Liren. White is more or less willing to continue with bishop to b2, putting more pressure on e5, and at some point being able to, for example, play knight c4, or as Kamsky did in this game, knight h4, knight f5, with sometimes f4 ideas, enabling white to play on this diagonal, trying to challenge the pawn on e5. So there are ideas like this. This was a game between Kamsky and Aronian back already in 2006. And many other players played b3, but nobody played knight b3 before. So as we will see in the game, the goal, the aim of this knight on b3 is to reach the unusual square on a5, from where it will attack both b7 on c6. This is white's idea. So, for example, let's say that black's castles on the short side Knight a5, you can't push b7 because c6 is hanging. So rook b8 and bishop to b5 to g5. And here, surprisingly, it's quite hard for black to do anything, because you can't move the knight on f6, of course, you can't move the pawn on b6, you can't move the bishop, because you need to keep this one protected. You can't really move the queen, because the only square is here, otherwise if you come to d7, it will take on f6, damaging the pawn structure, so it's hard for black to do something, and even after h6, bishop h4. If he goes g5, then bishop g3, and something like d4. I think this might be something that Anish has prepared. As black went with h6 and g5, you immediately counter-react on the center with d4, with an advantage for white. So instead, Liren played the logical move queen e7. I think c5 was another option, but after knight a5, there is no possibility of playing b6, because this time the pawn on e5 will have some problems after knight c6. So it's attacking the queen on d8 and also the pawn on e5, so the pawn is falling and white is already winning. So that means you still have to go with rook b8 with black, which is not something you want to do in that case, and again something like b3 or bishop to g5. The difference is bishop g5, you can go h6 and g5, and this is not the same because now black hasn't castled on the king side, so there might be some issues sometimes with g4, h5. It might be dangerous on the king side for white. This is not the same type of position than the one where black had castled already on the short side, on the king side. And after b3, so this is probably stronger, bishop b7, bishop b2. The position is balanced objectively. I'm not sure who is better. I guess Anish had an idea, but computers seems to show around equality here. So probably, or maybe it will be some kind of an improvement for black in the future. Because in the game, at first, it seemed that Anish was better after knight a5, because black has to long castle, and the position is going to be very complicated for them on the queen side. After bishop g4, c3, so white is intending to follow with b4 and a4, with some play with b5 quickly. So I checked rook h to g8 to also start an attack with g5, but in the end white is just, let's say, quicker in the attack after g5, a4, and for example knight h5 to reach the square on f4, then b5 takes, and d4 is coming with strength for white. The pawn on b5 is hanging, and in case of the natural c6, then d5 is going to blow everything on the queen side, and I think the king on c8 is in extreme danger. So there is no way black is getting enough counterplay in the next few moves before it's too complicated on the queen side. So instead, Liren tries to slow down white's play on the queen side. He plays c5. It controls the d4 and the b4 squares, so both b4 and d4 are more complicated to play for white, and that's why Anish Giri played a3. He wants to play b4 on the next move, so he needs to protect the square on b4. So c6 has been played, b4, and bishop c7. So now the knight on a5 is hanging, so it has to move again, so if you want to do something with the b pawn, of course. So he played knight b3. Potentially knight c4 was better, but complicated to understand why. Let's say knight b3 is very natural move. Knight d7, h3, challenging the bishop, bishop to h5, and bishop e3. And there was two good options for Liren. What he did was okay, definitely, but at some point he misplayed, but what he did was okay. And there was another option that I find even stronger. He played f5 immediately, but I think playing c4 first might have been better, because in that case, after d takes c4, f5, taking on f5 is no longer possible, because after takes on f5, then e4 is playable, because the pawn is no longer on d3, protecting d square. The pawn is already on c4. That makes a huge difference, and that means black is winning a piece on f3. And that simply means that taking on f5 is a blunder for white. So instead there are moves, of course, but knight c5 is apparently the best one, and if they're after knight c5, trying to protect the pawn on e4 or to trade a few pieces. Then after f4, changing the bishop, takes, and bishop somewhere, bishop c5 for example. Then queen e6 with some problems. Black is going to take on f3, and he's going to get a pawn back, because if you take back with the pawn, then h3 is falling. If you take back with the queen, then c4 is falling. And also there is the idea for black of going with g5, rook g8, g4 with a lot of play on the king side. It seems extremely dangerous for white. I really don't like the position. He is an extra pawn with white, but the extra pawn is on c3 and c4. It's just a double pawn. It's not much for white. So instead of this move, f5 was played. I think f5 is still a good move. Bishop takes c5, so winning a pawn, but there is a lot of play after rook b1 and g5. g5 is super strong for black. But here is the turnover of the game after e takes f5. I think this is maybe the decisive blunder by black. The good move was to take back with the queen immediately, intending to follow with g4 or rook g8 first, just opening the king side and attacking immediately. And after queen e4, to prevent this g4 move, simply come back to f6, and so the queen on e4 looks good, but after bishop g6 and the idea of playing h5 and g4, the play is so easy for black. The attack is playing by itself, and I really prefer black here. So black was probably much better, despite being a pawn down. For the moment, I mean, it's always the case in opposite side castles. You don't really care about the material. That's why Liren sacrificed the pawn without thinking much, I think. Yeah, the position is extremely difficult after this queen f6. And instead of almost a blunder by Liren, I'm not sure what he missed. After g4, his attack is going to be blocked with knight g5, attacking the queen, and that's the difference. The queen is not immediately on f5. He took on f5, and there was the option of taking on h3, but it's not great because the queen is also hanging on e2, of course. So takes on f7, takes on e2, there is a fork, so takes on h8. You can't really take on f1 due to knight f7 back, saving the knight and attacking the rook. And instead, rook takes, and there are some ideas with the bishop. You can attack the pawn on d3, it will attack both the rook on b1, the pawn on f5, so you are getting a few pawns with black. But rook d1 is apparently the best move here, keeping the advantage for white, and you can take back immediately on g2 or knight d2, intending to come on e4 with an amazing knight on e4, while especially the bishop on c7 is particularly bad. And white is almost a pawn up because g2 is going to be lost at some point. So a position in white's favor, definitely. And instead, queen takes f5 is no better, because after queen takes f5, white has the possibility of closing the king side. And that means Liren doesn't have an attack anymore, and Giri is going to rush attacking the black king, and he did it with a great strength. After b6, he played the super strong move, knight to e4. It's really an impressive move, so Anish is simply sacrificing the bishop on c5. There is not much choice but to take with black, because he's also intending to reach the d6 square. So that's why he took the bishop on c5, and of course you want to open files with white, sorry, so b takes c5. opening the b file and getting white ideas of playing d4 with the queen coming to a6, as we will see later. Knight f6 was played, and he simply gets the position as open as possible. He takes on d6, and now the knight is going to come to c5 as well. There is still an extra piece for white, for black, but there is nothing he can do with his poor king on c8. The position is really desperate. He played rook takes d6 because this pawn was an attacking pawn, so he wants to get rid of it. And d4, intending to come on a6 with the queen, and after king d8, for example, let's say the king tries to escape and to reach the king side. Then there is another idea for white, it's to take on e5, because of course taking back is with fork, so this will get to the position into completely one position for white, materially speaking. And there are also ideas like rook e6 and knight to d4 or knight e5, intending to attack the rook on e8, but also to play rook b8, winning the rook on h8, so white would be a pawn and an exchange up. Also, if you take, there is this knight e6 possibility, so completely winning for white. So taking is impossible on e5, and if the queen comes back to protect the rook on d6, then knight c5 is strong, queen c7, knight b7. Let's say it's basically game over. Black is unable to defend everything, and he's already with a bad material balance. So completely lost position, and the king is not safe. Nothing is okay with black's position. So he plays c5 to protect the pawn on a6. Knight takes, of course, the knight is coming into play. The rook on b1 is coming into play. And after the move rook e8, Liren eventually resigned after queen to c4 with some discovering check possibilities. And for example, let's say queen to b8, again you want to escape, then knight b7, check, takes, you have to take back with the king, and rook b7 is particularly strong with many ideas. Rook b1, bringing the other rook to b6, also taking on a6 or queen to c5. You already have a rook and two pawns versus two minor pieces, potentially other pawns to fall, and the king is simply hopeless on d6, so the position is lost. And that's why Liren resigned immediately after queen c4. He doesn't want to continue this game. I think Liren was probably pissed by his very bad move in that position. Taking on f5 was getting him the best position, and the move g4 was quite a big mistake, and that's how he eventually lost so quickly in this complicated position. So this is so good for Anish Giri. He is now just half a point behind Jan Nepomniachtchi. So he's clear second. He has chances to win other games probably and get first. So a very important win for the head of the race. And let's see the remaining 3 games of this tournament with at least 3 players able to win the candidates and be able to play against Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship match. See you tomorrow.